Rating a player isn't always easy or fair. We all have our own way of doing it. But when I read, due to his lack of commercial success, Rory Gallagher is often referred as the greatest guitarist you've never heard of, and listed as the 57th greatest guitarist of all time by Rolling Stone magazine. 57th. Well, all I can say is I disagree with that number. How about y'all? You know, I had a chance to go to a Rory Gallagher performance in 1979, and sadly I didn't do it for reasons I'm ashamed to say. Looking back on that decision, I feel I missed seeing and hearing one of the greatest live performing guitarists of all time. All I can do now is listen to his recordings and watch videos. And to make matters worse, the guy who had got the tickets for us ended up meeting and spending about 10 minutes talking to Rory in between his sound check and show that night. I'll get to more details about this meeting later on in the video, along with a few pictures I found from that same performance so long ago. But all I can say is, not going to that show is probably one of my biggest regrets. But enough of that. Let's get right into this video and start talking a little about Rory Gallagher, the musician and person he was. He was born William Rory Gallagher, March 2nd, 1948 in Ireland. His first memory of hearing a guitar was of the singing cowboy Gene Autry strumming away. His first guitar was a cheap acoustic, he said. It cost £3. He would then start to learn all the songs he heard on the radio. Skiffle was big at the time, and Lonnie Donegan was one of his first influences. But soon others, like Woody Guthrie, and a guy named Huddy Ledbetter, better known as just Leadbelly, was catching his ear with their bluesy folk music style. Being Irish, Rory would always say that he was attached to acoustic instruments, especially at a young age, and though he is probably most well known as a rock and blues electric guitarist to many, he was a very good acoustic player, and on many shows later on, he would always pull out an acoustic or his 1932 National Resonator guitar and play a few bluesy folk numbers on them. It was around the age of 12 that he got his first electric guitar, a Rossetti Solid 7. It was with this inexpensive guitar, made by Eggman, a Dutch manufacturer, that he would sit by the radio and learn to play Buddy Holly, Eddie Cochran, and Gene Vincent songs. 3 years later, at age 15, Rory was to join the Fontana Show Band in 1963. It was right around this time that he was to buy that 1961 Stratocaster guitar for £100 and making payments on it until he had it paid off. Never to be content as just a cog in a machine and playing dance hall friendly pop hits night after night, Rory would push himself harder as a guitarist and a vocalist. As his reputation began to grow, the Fontana changed their name to The Impact in 1965 to reflect a more blues rock oriented set list showcasing his amazing guitar work. Finally, a stripped down three-piece version of The Impact with Rory on guitar and vocals, Johnny Campbell on drums, and Oliver Tobin on bass found themselves playing gigs all over, including the club circuit in Hamburg, Germany. It was right after this, in 1966, that Rory was to quit The Impact, and a short time later formed The Taste, later to be known simply as Taste. This, I guess you could really say, was the start of his professional career, and it was during this time with Taste that Rory would really start writing and performing original songs. He was only 19 years old, and his reputation was soon to grow even more. In 1968, Taste began performing in the UK, with the original lineup split up. The new lineup formed with Richard McCracken on bass and John Wilson on drums. The new Taste moved permanently to London, where they signed with Polydor Records. While with Polydor, Taste began touring the United States and Canada with the British supergroup Blind Faith. In April 1969, Taste released the first of their 2 studio albums, the self-titled Taste, and then On the Boards, following in early 1970. but by the end of 1970, the band was to break up. In 1971, Rory released his self-titled album, Rory Gallagher. The 1970s was to be the peak of Rory's solo career, no doubt. He released some very good albums and toured consistently. And during this time, for all the great studio albums he released, in my opinion, his live albums and performances were head and shoulders above them all. He was just a great live performer. So my personal favorites, top 3 albums were, number 3 would have to be Tattoo. This album was released around 1973. Next, number 2 would be Live in Europe, another of the early 70s records. And my all-time number 1 favorite by Rory is Irish Tour 74. This album to me is Rory Gallagher at his very best. His vocals and guitar playing is out of sight. And to be honest, I would put this album close to the top of greatest all time of any live albums ever recorded. Of course, these are just mine, and I'm sure you have yours. These are just my suggestions for someone who may not be very familiar with Rory and who would like to get to know his sound better. These are the top 3 albums that hooked me on his playing. Feel free to let me know what others you like best in the comments section below. One thing I also think that some people miss on, and maybe this was just because his guitar playing was so great, was that Rory was a fantastic vocalist and wrote music that fit his style of singing so well. The guy could really sing. When you listen to his live recordings, he is up there working his tail off, and his vocals are spot on. And when he slows it down a little and does some of his acoustic style numbers, he has a very toned down and soothing voice also. This guy was just an all-around talent, the whole package, as they say. I'm a big fan of Rory's live performances. In the beginning of the video, I spoke of a concert of his I had a chance to see and missed, and still regret missing it to this day. The pictures coming up were taken at this show. I can't give credit to whoever took these because there was no name on them, but whoever it was, I thank them for the memories. This show took place at Mississippi Nights down on the river in St. Louis. A guy I was friends with at the time went down early and could hear the sound check going on. After it was over, Rory came out to his bus and there was a few people around. He said he took time and signed autographs for quite a while. My friend got to speak with him for a bit, and he told me later, for as great as a player that Rory was, he was also one of the nicest and most humble musicians he's ever had the pleasure of meeting. And the more I read and research Rory's life, it looks like not just my friend says this. There are so many more who think this way too. So this leads me a little into Rory Gallagher, the person off stage. If you've ever seen him on stage, you know how intense and powerful he sounds. But off stage, he seems to be just a laid-back and down-to-earth person. I don't think he ever lets his great musical talent get in the way of this. Alec Lifeson of Rush tells a few stories about Rory, and I want to share just one of those now that I think really shows this. Back in the fall of 1974, Rush was the opening act for Rory as they were touring across Canada and parts of the U.S. Alex says they were young and excited and just trying to stay in the background and do their thing. He says Rory and his band were so hospitable, he just made them feel comfortable on tour. Rory also told them if they were to get called for an encore, to get out there and do it. Now I know this don't sound like much, but really back in those days, that didn't happen too often. The headliners didn't like opening acts stealing the thunder, so to speak. They wanted you to warm up the crowd, not make them hot for more. But not Rory. He just wasn't that kind of musician or person. Some years later, after Rush became headliners in the early 80s, they had Rory opening for them. And Alex says he was just a pleasure to be around, and he learned many things from him. Not just music, but about life in general. Speaking of Rush, I have a video up on my channel you might enjoy if you're a Rush fan. It has some really good pictures and insight to a 1975 concert I attended, where Rush opened the show for none other than Charlie Daniels. I'll put a link up right here if you might be interested in watching it. Of course, you can't talk about Rory and his music without talking about his tone, which came from his guitars, amps, and of course, his technique and touch. But I would guess the most talked about is his number one guitar, that beat-up 61 Fender Stratocaster he always had with him. When I saw some close-up pictures on it, especially the back, I thought, my God, it looks like a grooved and worn piece of wood left out in the weather. Then I found out it actually had been left out in the weather. The guitar was stolen from him in 1966. His nephew Daniel told the story. Actually, both his Strat and a Telecaster were stolen. The Ireland's version of Crime Watch did a story on them. He said it was done very condescending, like, oh, and a young man with long hair has had 2 of his guitars stolen. If anyone sees them, they look like this, and the picture went up on the screen. Daniel went on to say they got dumped in a ditch about 2 weeks later because the guy couldn't sell them now that they'd been on television. We have to remember this was 1966, and it was probably one of the only Strats in Ireland. So because they were too hot, he dumped them in a ditch where someone found them about 2 weeks later, and Rory had them back. But I think it got a bit of water damage from that, and probably a lot of scratches from brambles and all. So that, along with the years and years of playing, took its toll on the looks of it. But as far as a player, the guitar is said to be one of the best out there. There's a video on YouTube with his nephew talking more about this. I'll put a link down in the comments section below. You can go check it out. It's really worth watching if you're into guitars. Rory could play a variety of instruments. He played the mandolin, the accordion, harmonica, the piano, and the saxophone. I always enjoyed hearing him play the acoustic with his harmonica hanging around his neck. The guy could really play a variety of music styles and play them all very well. He had a great voice, especially for the bluesy rock songs, and could deliver a folk song that was sweet to the ears. Rory was a whole package. Why he never rated higher than he did, I just don't know. Maybe I'm just looking at it as such a big fan of his. Use the comments section to enlighten me on something I might be missing, why his name isn't mentioned more, along with all the other great players. He found success with a solo career, releasing music throughout the 70s and 80s, and selling more than 30 million records worldwide. He is credited with influencing guitarists such as Eric Clapton and Brian May, and I'm sure many more. One thing about Rory I admire, he stuck to the music that was in his heart and soul. I'm sure he, like many others, could have found more commercial success in the rock industry, became a bigger name had he followed the guidelines set by the record company. Rory played over 2,000 shows during his career. His final performance was on 10th of January in 1995 in the Netherlands. He was visibly ill and the tour had to be canceled. He was admitted to the hospital in London in March 1995, and it was only then that the extent of his ill health became apparent. His liver was failing, and the doctors determined that, in spite of his young age, a liver transplant was the only possible course of action. After 13 weeks in intensive care, while waiting to be transferred to a convalescent home, his health suddenly worsened, and when he contracted a staph infection, and he died on June 14, 1995, at the age of 47. He was unmarried and had no children. I'm sure Rory had his faults like we all do, and when I say you would need a big shovel to try to dig up some mud on him, I'm sure you could if you want to. But when it is all said and done, that the good in him would always outweigh the bad. He loved his family, fans, friends, fellow musicians, and especially his music. The family keeps a website up and running. It is loaded with information, and all his music and merch is there. Drop by and pick something out. The address is rorygallagher.com. I gotta go. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you have anything else to add, as I only covered a small part of Rory's life here, so feel free to leave a comment. Thank you all for watching and subscribing. I do appreciate it.